Hi everybody, Jason here. Today we have another episode of Ask Jason. Now if you're new to my channel, Ask Jason is a video series where I answer your questions on Eastern spirituality. Now today we have a great question from Cynthia. Now Cynthia says to me, I loved your video on Taoism's aimlessness versus Western purpose. It made me feel relieved in not being a go-getter. But my question is, even without purpose, should we have goals at all? Can goals motivate us towards something such as spiritual liberation? What would Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi say about having goals? Now this is a great follow-up to that video, Cynthia. Thank you for the question. And a lot of people actually were quite relieved in watching that video because of this tendency that the world has to tell you that you ought to have purpose, right? Which is obviously coupled with goals and this idea of success in the West. So we'll try and look at this from a Taoist perspective when we look at goals, but we'll flip-flop through some of the traditions to give you kind of a greater understanding. And as I said in the first video on purpose, if you do have a purpose or you don't have a purpose, it doesn't matter. Don't overthink it. Don't think it's right or wrong. We have to get out of this mindset, as I mentioned in that video, of right or wrong. Like this is kind of a Western and Christian way of thinking because we're kind of making it something, right? Where the Taoist idea is just to go with life and move efficaciously through life. Now, if you have a goal, great. If you don't have a goal, that's also great. So this is the tendency and this is the attitude that a Taoist would have. But to dive deep into if we should have a goal, then we can't just leave it off there. We have to really examine why we have goals in the first place. Now, you mentioned having a goal such as spiritual liberation, right? So you could say that in the beginning of your spiritual process, that we all have this idea of enlightenment or liberation or just freedom itself. And that's not an unhealthy thing. That's a pretty healthy desire to have, right? We don't want to go and demonize all desires. And Taoism actually don't demonize all desires. They just mention that desires tend to take us down blind alleys. But this desire is a healthy desire to have because you're talking about the ultimate. So in Buddhism, there's this idea of bodhicitta. So you need to have bodhicitta if you are going to strive for enlightenment. Bodhicitta is like this energy that you have for your spiritual practice, the effort you put in, and so forth and so on. And if we look at that from a Taoist perspective, like if you are involved in the internal arts, especially of Taoism, if you practice Tai Chi Chuan or a form of Qigong or various forms of meditation, then initially there's effort, right? There's effort. But what happens is this idea of wu-wei starts to kick in when you have this idea of effortless action. So you're doing it as kind of like a limb of the Tao. You're like this aperture for the Tao to express its beauty. And so then it's doing you are not doing it, right? This is what Alan Watts once mentioned. And so you're just moving with the Tao as it. And from that perspective, goals disappear because you're just moving with life. And you fundamentally realize that the journey is the destination. It's not some goal in the far off distance that you ought to reach. Now, when we examine a goal, right, and we've all encountered this, we have one particular goal and we strive very hard to reach that goal. And once we reach it, there's already 4 or 5 other goals that have presented itself. And then you don't really appreciate attaining that goal as much as you probably thought you would. And I've experienced this myself as being an author. Like especially when I had my first book that was published, you know, I kind of had this idea of what it would feel like and so forth and so on. But once it happened and I went through it, I had already started writing my next book. So I just moved on. Like it's there and I hope people enjoy it, but I already had moved on. And especially this is when I started to understand even more deeply that goals themselves are illusory. In some sense, you can say it's good to have some sort of goal for certain things, but the goal itself has no solidity. And when we talk about spiritual liberation, as you mentioned, the irony here with spiritual liberation is that when you continue to have that as a goal, you'll continue to miss it because you'll get to one level of a mountain and you think you've reached the top and then you look up and there's another peak. See, the idea in Eastern spirituality is you have to give up the search. You see, you have to give up the search for the same reason as I mentioned, that once we reach a goal, it's pretty empty and has no solidity, and there's always other goals that present themselves. So we find ourselves running in circles with one goal after the other, and there's no so-called like real ultimate goal. And this essentially, as I mentioned, relates to enlightenment or spiritual liberation, because if you continue to have this goal of enlightenment or spiritual liberation, it'll continue to elude you. And practices like Taoism, Vedanta, Buddhism are often about giving up the search. Now, one of the greatest stories, obviously, is the story of Gautama the Buddha. Buddha went on this 6-year journey and practiced all sorts of spiritual practices, right? He practiced extreme asceticism, and he was out in the wilderness in northern India in the Bihar area, and he went through 6 years of basically torturing himself. And when he had completely exhausted himself, he just collapsed in a big heap and accepted a milky soup from a girl herding cattle in the Bodh Gaya area. And then when he just sat down and finally ate something, that's when he realized that all of his striving and searching was eclipsing the actual experience of enlightenment. That's when he sat under the Bodhi tree and had the experience of nirvana. And so that's one of the great stories that is a metaphor for all of us, because often when we're searching and striving for a goal, that goal continues to elude us, and especially when we're talking about enlightenment or spiritual liberation. Because as I mentioned in my book, Enlightenment Now, we are fundamentally enlightened. We're already that now. But what eclipses that is this tendency we have to search and strive for goals, and this persona that we have that's wound up in this success-seeking and achieving mentality that the world tells you ought to follow. The world doesn't tell you that you're already perfect the way you are now. And that's the Eastern spiritual perspective, right? You are already perfect the way you are now. You don't have to get a goal to validate your existence. You don't need purpose to validate your existence. As I said, you can have those, but that will never define who you are. You see, it will never define who you are. You'll be constantly searching something that doesn't essentially exist and cannot define who you are. And that's the important thing we need to understand about goals and even purpose, as I mentioned in that first video on that. And so the Taoist view is just to allow life to be as it will without having a mentality of having goals or purpose. You're allowing life to be as it will. Now, this is what the Genren is in Taoism, the genuine person, the Taoist sage. They follow life as nature is. They don't dictate towards nature what they want because they don't have any desires. They're just moving with life as life, and whatever presents itself, they deal with that situation in an efficacious manner. They deal with each and every situation immediately and appropriately without being fooled by this idea of having a purpose or a goal. So we need to have the courage to let go of life, let go of striving, and allow the Tao's power to become our power. This is what De is in Chinese. De is virtue. Now, De is, to use a river as an analogy, is when we let go of the banks of the river and we stop fighting the current and we just go with the river, the Tao's power becomes our power. This is what De is. And this is what virtue is. And so we need the courage to actually do that. And so if you experience goals or you have purpose, it will all be within the scope of that river, of the Tao moving you in that direction. You won't have this mentality of trying to control your reality. I need to attain that goal. This is my purpose now. And, we see a lot of this with go-getters and entrepreneurs and this and that. And unfortunately, a lot of people are listening to these entrepreneurs and trying to mimic their reality, their experience. That's for them. Live your life. That's what Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi would say. Live your life. And to be a Genren, you can't live your life through your conditioning, because once you live in your life through your conditioning, then you are comparing your life to others and you want to do certain things from comparing your life to others. You are influenced by socialization. You're influenced by the culture, by religions, by society in general. You are not essentially genuine. And so once you come back into that place, the natural self, beneath all of this conditioning we had, and you move as one with the river, then you will experience the life that is ready for you, right? Not the life that you're projecting out based on comparing your life to others. And so that's a big thing with goals, right? And purpose. A lot of people base their life on others. And so we have these goals based on the life of other people. Oh, they were successful at that, so maybe I should be successful at that too. Do you. Don't do them. Do you. And this is a big thing in the world these days. Most people online, especially on social media, and people trying to become entrepreneurs, are doing other people. They're not doing them. And essentially then there's no originality, no authenticity, and you can tell that they're not genuine. They're doing it to attain certain goals, to acquire a certain wealth, status, etc. Taoism pulls all of that apart and wants you just to merge with the river. Where that takes you, who knows? Allow the universe to do its thing. Remember, your sense of ego, your sense of the accumulative self is an illusion. And what people don't understand about Taoism is that when you're functioning from that place, the Tao's power cannot become your power, because that acts as a fundamental blockage to the fundamental forces of the universe moving through you. So once you begin to downregulate that sense of self, to dissolve that self, then the Tao's power becomes your power. And once that happens, then if you have a goal, doesn't matter. If you have purpose, it doesn't matter. The idea of spiritual enlightenment will even disappear. So I hope that answers your question, Cynthia, and I hope you all enjoyed that today. And if you want to support my work, please head on over to my Patreon page or head over to my PayPal page as well. And any support is highly appreciated, because we're trying to peel the layers back here of Eastern spirituality, and with your support, we can keep diving deeper, and I can keep expanding this content and improving the production quality. So I hope you all enjoyed today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.